Thank you everyone for coming. Another nice turnout for Dr. Jose Lobo. He is a professor in the School of Sustainability and associated with many other schools across ASU. And I have never seen Jose present before, so I'm pretty excited about this. So he's going to be discussing intersections between how we can tackle sustainability plus climate challenges together, and then looking at some of the knowledge gaps in that sphere. And probably a lot of other things. So I'll let you take it away.
Hope you don't mind if I pace a lot. I'm from Puerto Rico and I'm addicted to coffee, so I'm going to use this space. So let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to do. It's going to be a little bit different from your usual presentation, but she gave me permission. So in that, I'm going to talk to you about research, but I want to share with you the beginnings of what I think is a global conversation, also national, but I'm going to have more of an emphasis on the global conversation on that intersection. Yes, that's not a very poetic title, but this intersection of addressing climate change in urban areas and the sustainability goals. And it is a conversation that is pointing out some significant gaps in research and training and engagement, which I think actually are opportunities for us at SOS and at ASU. It is a conversation that already some of you are very much involved with, but I think there is room, I might even say, an obligation to do a lot more. Okay? So what's the setting? I think 2023 will go down as the year in which there was a very open acknowledgement that we are not going to stick to that mythical 1.5 degree warming. That acknowledgement took a while. That was not an ex acknowledgement, so there is a very authoritative figure who says that. Here's someone else who happens to agree. James Skia is the coordinator of the IPCC. That is not yet the official position of the IPCC, but I have known him from before he was. He actually even more happens to agree. If you want to know what James really knows, you can come and talk to me afterwards because this is being recorded, and I now understand that. So, but I think this is the setting. So talking about what to do with climate change is no longer something that we can avoid. And very interestingly, you know, this was a report that the 6th assessment cycle of the IPCC published last year. There are two things, well, maybe more than two, but there are two very striking things about this report in comparison to the many, many, many reports the IPCC have prepared before. If you read this report carefully, and okay, this is the type of thing that maybe identifies me as a woke person, you can actually count how many times does the word mitigation appear compared to the word adaptation, and then you can calculate the ratio. Okay, I did that. And adaptation appears way more than in previous reports in the IPCC. So this report is the IPCC acknowledging we are going to have to adapt. Okay. Now the question, of course, is who is that we and how? But that's very, very significant. Okay. And I'm going to refer to this a little bit later on. This report raises a concept that's quite striking, and in many parts of the global south, very controversial, but I think we need to engage with, which is that of limits to adaptation. I'll return to that. But there's another way in which this report was really striking, okay? Which is that cities play a very prominent role in this report. And if you're at all familiar with IPCC as a process, it's good to be reminded it is a group of researchers, scientists, such as us, but at the service of a UN body, okay? So anything that the IPCC publishes, you have to think of it as it has gone through a very convoluted process. If you're at all familiar with the IPCC process, you will know that for many years, there was a variety of reasons why highlighting cities was deliberately not done. This report is the first report in which cities play a very prominent role. Why? Because that's where a lot of people are, okay? If you read the report carefully also, I would say there's another third aspect that I think is kind of different. And this, by the way, was much more evident in the press conference in which this report was presented. This is the first time the IPCC acknowledges that the effects of climate change are indeed going to be different in the global north and the global south. Who knows? Maybe the people of Sweden will have longer swimming seasons. And it does mention that thinking about the effect of climate change in urban areas in the global south is very pressing. So I thought, wow, well, as someone who cares a lot about urbanization and urban areas, I thought that was very important, okay? And it does sound the alarm about what those effects are. And it so happens, if you want to do this exercise in geography, go to ChatGPT and ask to show you the map of where are most of the urban areas in the global south. They are along coastlines, or they are in areas where they're going to be very affected by rising heat. So this is an important thing to think about, okay? Now, there's more to come, because for the 7th assessment cycle, and if you're not familiar with this lingo, the assessment cycle, that's just the IPCC's term for next 3, 4, 5 years. What are we going to be working on? One of the main themes for the 7th assessment cycle is urban adaptation to climate change. And I just want to mention that there's one working group within the IPCC that's tasked with making a report on that. And it has 2 coordinators. One of them happens to be an ASU graduate, Winston Chow, who's going to be here, I believe, sometime in March. Yes, he's going around the world asking people, what do you think we should do about urban adaptation to climate change? So he's coming to ASU. So this is, again, significant, okay? Now, there were already some sneak previews, if you care about reading it. You know, the IPCC, again, the way they work is they publish kind of a specific reports before they publish the synthesis one. So already these 2 reports in 2022, these 2 different reports were the first time that there were chapters devoted to cities. Okay, what do I want to highlight? It is an important shift for the IPCC, which I think signals the need to engage in an effort. And in a moment, you will see, especially with those communities that will be affected by these effects, on how to respond to the effects of climate change, okay? And here's yet another report that was put out, not an IPCC report. The language used by the IPCC is something along the lines, we are aware of this report, we don't officially endorse it, but we don't mind it. Okay, again, just remember the IPCC is, in a sense, a political body, okay? And now, what's interesting about all these reports I've been telling you is that throughout of them, the IPCC highlights something that maybe you will think is obvious. I'm sure for everybody in this audience is obvious, but that is the notion that whatever needs to be done to address the effects of climate change in urban areas in the global south needs to be consistent with the many other challenges that those urban areas face. Poverty alleviation, poverty reduction, providing electricity to households in slums. Again, that's kind of obvious. But what's important is to realize that if you do believe that, then you have to think about how can we do this? How can we respond to the effects of climate change in Mumbai while continuing with the efforts of increasing the number of households in Mumbai that have a running toilet? Okay? And I'm going to do to you what I do to every one of my undergraduate classes, but I always do ask them, let's do an informal survey. If today you have to decide for the rest of your life, you have a choice, very faithful. You'll have access to a cell phone or you'll have access to a toilet, but not both. Which one would you choose? Toilet. Well, you know, I'm not gonna tell you how sometimes I sometimes sit there and I find undergraduates who sit there thinking about it and say, are you kidding me? Are you actually thinking of life without a toilet, but with a cell phone? I guess that tells that I am officially an old fart. But this notion, okay, how, of course, which raises the question, how to do that, okay? So here's another thing that happened in 2023, okay? In preparation for the Sustainability Development Goals that occurred last fall in September, there was a report that was produced by the United Nations. And this report very strikingly says, we cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals without tying them to responding to effects of climate change or vice versa. I mean, this is a very strong claim. And so that's why I'm going to be using the term, well, they use the term synergies a lot. They have to be tackled together. And understanding that if that synergy does not occur, basically, there will not be urban adaptation to climate change, okay? Now, I should mention, as I said, most of my emphasis is on the Global South, but another report that came out last fall, if you get the sense like, wow, does Jose spend most of his time in his computer drinking coffee and reading reports? Wow, yeah, I guess that's my social life. Yes, there. So this is the 5th National Climate Assessment that came out last fall. And it, for the first time, has a chapter on cities, the effect of climate change in urban communities in the United States. So I think by now you get the point. Wow, the effect of climate change on cities. Also, by the way, chapter 18 proclaims that if you're going to think meaningfully and effectively about how to respond to the effects of climate change, you need to have a set and complexity perspective. You might also want to know that one of the senior co-authors of that chapter is a graduate of SOS. So, we don't entirely waste our time. So, now, here's another report. Wow, yes, man, I read a lot of reports. Okay, well, you know, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm hyper caffeinated. What should I do? Let me read the latest UN report. Well, here's another one, okay? And of course, if you're into cities, when you read something like this, oh, I practice this English phrase, and I'm gonna mock it up. This is a type of statement that makes my heart go, pitter patter? Yeah, okay, I got it, I practice, okay. Because this is a report that basically says, again, you wanna achieve the SDGs, you have to think of how achieving them is gonna further climate change and vice versa. Okay, this is, again, you can read it. It says a global program that focuses exclusively on synergies in cities will provide major benefits in both the climate and development agendas. Wow, that's pretty cool, pretty lit. To quote my undergraduate. Now, if you're wondering, is there a chapter in that report that says, how are we gonna do that? No. I mean, there's no such chapter. But you should be glad about that. If there was such a chapter, what's our use? There isn't that chapter. So we can actually do something. Actually, more importantly, we can join existing efforts that are trying to address this, okay? Now, one important thing is that that report does openly acknowledge that there are synergies, but one has to be very careful that synergies can often be perceived as trade-offs. And one has to take that seriously. Do you leave coal on the ground, or do you become a moderately prosperous society? Which, by the way, is still the official statement of what is the goal of Chinese economic development policy, is to become a moderately prosperous society. The official goal is not to take over the world. And actually, they even provide a number for what is the GDP per capita that they will identify with that. Here's a quiz. I'm a teacher, I cannot resist this. If China were to achieve their own goal, at that point, which will have a higher GDP per capita, China or Mexico? You can probably tell by my tone. It will be Mexico. When's the last time we had discussions about Mexico taking over the United States? Oh, wait, migrants. Yes, I shouldn't ask that. Okay. You know, do you decarbonize your economy as quickly as you can, or do you increase the supply of electricity to your urban population, which is the dilemma in South Africa? If any of you have visited South Africa, and we have a South African in the audience, South Africans have become obsessed, and they know it. It's like they have a microchip. What hours of the day today will I not have electricity? Okay? The easiest way to perceive that is a trade-off. What are you going to do next year? Okay? And you know, this is not so exotic. Greening the labor force or fighting inflation. Okay? So I do think we need to take that seriously, that if we don't think about it carefully, if we don't think about it, how to actually do this, an opportunity or a synergy can just become a trade-off. And we might not, you know, the thing about asking the people what they want is that they may not always agree with you. And by the way, if you want to speak about trade-off, I cannot resist this because I do tend to dislike moralizing attitudes from people in the global north when they speak to the global south. So notice that the people of Germany had a choice. What's the big deal? Wear your parka in your home during the winter. What's the big deal? Just wear your parka. Or are you going to reactivate coal-fired plants? I heard from colleagues who were at the COP last year from India that they were waiting for the opportunity to pounce on German delegates who would do their usual global south, why are you not speeding up your decarbonizing? And so this trade-offs, okay? This is very serious, okay? Now, here's what I do want to talk about a little bit of research. If we start to think about how we're going to think about those trade-offs, I hope there are trade-offs, but let's say we do want to be scientists here. We're asking the question, can we honestly arrive at answers about what those synergies could be? I think it's important to remember, well, maybe you don't need to be reminded, that we have been studying cities and urbanizations for decades from a variety of disciplines. Many, many disciplines have studied cities. So I will argue, and I think many of you will agree, that we have accumulated some insights as to how have cities been engines of economic development. They've done that. How has that happened? What features of urban areas throughout geography, throughout the past? And you know, we're living through an era now where we have now the ability to study urbanization, not just 200 years ago. I remember when I would think of the past, for me, the past was 100 years. Wow, that's really old. Then I started hanging out with archaeologists at ASU, and it's like, wow, you talk about 5,000 years ago. That's really old. So we studying cities in all sorts of contexts and learning a lot. And there are even a set of concepts about what is it that happens inside cities that makes them be the drivers of development. And they go on this label of agglomeration effects. And here, if you wanna, here's the slide, okay? Wow, there it is, look at it. That's the one slide summary of agglomeration effects. Decades of study about why our cities are using development in one slide, okay? I don't expect you to go over it. Now, here's a question. Where are adaptation synergies in all of this? But to me, that's a very specific research question, that one that we ought to be able to answer because we have spent so much time studying up cities and we have learned, it's not just, okay? But this is an effort that is ongoing, that communities worldwide of researchers have started to do, including some colleagues here at ASU, okay? So let's find them. Let's find the ways in which what makes cities cities historically overlap with what we think needs to be done to prepare cities for climate change. And I said, so this will be an example of a research effort that I think needs to be increased, accelerated, but it is starting globally. That's an important research effort, okay? Now, the other thing that I want to highlight is that by now it almost has become a cliche. You want to think about cities, Well, you have to think about sets and you have to think about complex systems. Yes, 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 yes. But what does that mean in the context of what are we going to do? I think we need to do that transition. It's not enough to say, look, cities are complex, which often comes across like it's so complex that we cannot do anything. So let's wait. Now, maybe someone is prepared to say that is, I'm not going to prejudge that. That might actually be a legitimate conclusion. But we need to go beyond. So even the OECD, not known to be an organization that likes to be out there intellectually, is now using this language, okay? But what does that mean for actually making decisions, choices, okay? Wow, here is another report. But I must say, when I read this section, I will tell you what came to mind and said, wow, it's almost as if someone took David's writings and Hallie's writings and Brendan's writing and fed them through ChatGPT, which I will do that experiment, by the way. I'm gonna, in my spare time, since when I sit there, I'm gonna get your writings, Hallie's writings, Brendan's writings, force it into ChatGPT and see if it comes with this. But read this, okay? So this is a report that came out of the SDG summit, came out, okay? And it's supposed to address the question, what's standing between us and this glorious, sustainable future? What's standing? What is it? What are the barriers? Wow, okay. And it identified many, not surprising, but it did highlight that one of them is that we actually don't know enough about how to implement these goals, especially now in the context of climate change. So we need new science, but not just any science. It talks about developing knowledge in collaboration with the communities that are going to be affected by this. And I think that's just really striking. So to me, it almost seems like, wow, we could have written that. That's kind of amazing, okay? Now, so we think about how we're going to do this. What is the mystery of academics like us collaborating with communities in slums throughout the global south? If you permit me to say, it's not a mystery. Let's go. Let's collaborate with them. We all have choices. I can decide to spend my sabbatical somewhere in Oxford in the UK, or scuba diving in the Caribbean, or I can collaborate with these communities. And there is a growing movement to involve slum dwellers organizations in research about what's going to happen in your communities. It's thriving in India, in South Africa, in Brazil, in Mexico. And it is a recognition that almost by definition, slums have a lot of experience in building resilient communities. Slums, by definition, have had to survive political shocks, environmental shocks, economic shocks, and they're still there. And no, slums are not just one undifferentiated sea of misery. They're very thriving communities, many of them. I don't want to glorify slums. So to me, this is an example of an ongoing global research effort that some of you are already part of, but I think we in SOS, we in ASU really need to think of ways, so how can we contribute to this? Because this is trying to elicit this new information, new knowledge about what can these communities do, what can be done. And there's lots of stuff that's being done, community mapping, community data collection, community identification of ecosystem services, community recognition of risk. There's a lot of knowledge, okay? Mapping is very powerful, especially if you're aware about the history of slums. One of the first almost existential, okay, fight sounds too aggressive. One of the, I'm gonna use it. One of the existential fights of slums worldwide is to convince the authorities, I exist, I am here. And mappings are very powerful. And now we have the ability to make incredibly accurate maps. So this is fantastic, especially in a context where you have a type of creature very different from me who actually knows how to use their cell phone. So imagine what happens when you bring together young community activists, open mapping, and generative AI. I have no idea. It might explode, or it might not. But again, what I emphasize, there are these efforts at trying to use technology to address some of these issues and gain some of this knowledge of. So that's a very detailed map, open quest map of Kailicha. That's an informal settlement in Cape Town, South Africa. Okay, so this then has led to a concept that actually has been spearheaded by organizations of slum dwellers or informal settlements, locally led adaptation. Climate change is a global problem, but there's also this notion that the response to it is going to be very local. Now, local might just mean, you mean a neighborhood, a street, a city, an urban area, an urban region, but it's already there, and there's lots of work. And some of the foundational work, as I said, has been spearheaded by NGOs from the Global South. There is by now a global commission on adaptation that has lots of organizations that belong to it. Goodness, even USAID is in it. Sorry, maybe I just committed a microaggression against USAID. I'm from a certain generation of Latin American activists for whom USAID did not have a nice history, but I understand organizations can change. Yes, even imperialist can cease being imperialist, I suppose. So ASU is not a member of this coalition, but it's an attempt to have some agreement among groups that either finance adaptation work, support adaptation work, do research adaptation work. How are we going to involve local communities? It's a thriving effort. We don't have to invent it. We can collaborate with it, okay? And as I said, and by now there's almost a lot of work about what should that look like. And again, the issue here is not just there's an ethical obligation to involve the communities that will be most directly affected. And everybody agrees, starting with IPCC. The communities that are going to be who are already at the forefront of experiencing the effects of climate change are poor urban communities. So just a basic sense of fairness and justice suggests we need to involve them. But I will argue it's also a matter of efficacy. It's a matter of, if you do want to design policies, make choices, take actions with some expectation that they will work, you need knowledge and information that often, in many parts of the Global South, the governmental agencies that you might expect, oh, where do you go to if you need someone to tell you how many people are employed in this part of the city? You have to engage with these communities. So I think there's an ethical obligation and an efficacy obligation to collaborate. And again, slum dwellers organizations have been at the forefront of developing this notion, okay? Here's another striking thing. This, again, going back to this report that came out of the Sustainability Goals Summit. This report about what's blocking us. As I said, I already highlighted that the main thing it highlighted is lack of knowledge. Now, I think that's important because there might be a tendency to say, we all agree on the goals. Yes, yes. That doesn't mean that you know how to get there. I mean, it's kind of obvious. But I personally feel that often the discussion about the SDGs tended to minimize the fact that, wow, there's so many interesting challenges here, and actually how to achieve them might not be entirely clear. But it also, as the second obstacle that it highlights is, and this I'm going to read, there's a critical worldwide shortage of skilled practitioners in academia, research institutions, international agencies, civil service, NGOs, private sector, with the necessary knowledge, training, and predispositions to successfully identify and implement the cross-sectional opportunities, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it's too long, okay? Action on climate and sustainable development requires a multidisciplinary and systems approach coupled with a commitment to promote just transitions, participatory approaches, and inclusivity at all levels. Okay, people of the world, send them to us, we'll take care of this. I mean, we could have written that. Maybe for all I know, someone did. But again, that's quite striking. This notion that achieving these synergies will require lots of people at many different levels of engagement who are both trained but have the predisposition to seek the type of knowledge that will make this possible. And I think this speaks directly to when we think about what should we be doing in SOS? What are we gonna do in SOS? What are we gonna teach in SOS? I mean, and to me, this is quite striking. Again, when you think about, wow, what are obstacles preventing us from achieving SDGs? Is it technology? Is it financing? Is it politics? This report highlighted science and training. Pretty striking, okay? Now, as I said, there is a concept. Well, is it a concept or a phenomenon that began to be discussed a lot last year in a variety of audiences? Limits to adaptation. What if you are dealing with a part of the world? Well, let me just give you an example. Take the city of Durban in South Africa. You may not be familiar with it. It's one of South Africa's main cities, very important economic hub. It is expected to suffer very directly from rising sea levels. There's a chief sustainability officer in Durban. Her name is Deborah Roberts, who, by the way, was very instrumental in nudging the IPCC to go urban. Okay, so she has been very important. And if you talk to her about, well, so what's Durban going to do? In the time that there is, and it's striking, and I don't think I'm betraying any confidence, where Deborah's view is, I think we're going to have to relocate Durban. And I remember the first time I had this conversation with Deborah, I said, did I hear you say relocate a community of people in South Africa? Yes, you did, Jose. If you know anything about the history of South Africa, relocating people in South Africa is not a topic you bring up, you know. I mean, wow, you know, that's what the British did. That's what the colonialists did. So how do you talk about it? And now you ask Deborah, well, why do you want to go that route? Well, let's say that what about the capacities, the financing? Yes, we can sit here and wait for the global north to do what it says it's going to do regarding financing, but no one expects that to happen. And that conversation is happening already in many parts of the global south. What if the adaptive response is to move? Now think of all the questions that raises. Move where? Move how? Who decides how to move? Who decides who to move? Who decides when do we start moving? I mean, I find it almost overwhelming. And if you try to ask, well, what is the history? What history do we have? What's the historical record of large urban populations living in an urban area? Well, there's a record. There was a city, there was a volcanic eruption, most people died, and the survivors left. Okay, that's maybe not a hopeful example. Well, we know of urban populations in World War II Europe. Their cities were bombed to smithereens, they left. Okay, maybe, again, not a hopeful example. So this is, I think, one of the most striking areas where research and engagement is needed, because if this is going to be other than an invitation to a lot of suffering, how to do this? For example, what are the signals? When do you decide? Okay, we tried to do whatever, and we don't have time, and we need to think about large-scale relocation. What are those metrics? You probably don't want to wait until, well, the water's up to my ankles, or you know what? I went out and I tried to walk to campus and I fainted because it's so hot. Okay, but seriously, what are they? And I want to highlight even the choice of language matters, okay? So I now notice there are these two terms that are being used. Well, there's more than two. So there's managed retreat. But you talk to some of the urban dwellers in some of these cities, and there's this notion of climate forced eviction. Are people going to be asked to leave, even though they're told it's for your own good? Again, in many urban areas in the global south, that phrase, you're going to have to move, is for your own good. You're going to go somewhere, wait a while, you come back, and it's going to be all great for you. That, if you have any experience of urban development in the global south, if you work with slum communities, that's so. How do you talk about managed retreat with slum dwellers who have a history of saying, you are talking about relocation? I know what that means. How do you do that? Will managed retreat be the urban poor being dislodged? And that can be Miami, or it can be Durban, as I said, okay? So again, I don't know how familiar you are with Miami. For years, there was a the geography of Miami reflected a class distinction. The very wealthy, the well-to-do lived close to the water. Of course, you're in Miami, that's what you want to do. And the poorer communities lived inland. Or, okay, this is kind of funny, depending upon your notion of heights, in the high parts of Miami, 206 feet above ground. But hey, okay. Now, what you're starting to see as the well-to-do, I don't want to say wealthy, because not everybody who lives along the water in Miami is wealthy. Many of those households are confronting a reality of one industry that is not debating is climate change real or not, and that's the insurance industry. And you cannot buy insurance against flooding or hurricanes in Miami. Now, if you're really, really wealthy, your attitude can be, I don't care, there's a hurricane, my house is destroyed, I build it again. There aren't enough wealthy people living along the coastline of Miami. So you're beginning to see a population movement into the heights, displacing a lot of the people who live there. And now you could say, well, that's the process, they can move. Now you ask, what's happening with those people who are being displaced? Oh, I don't know, they go somewhere else. They go to Orlando. But that's happening. It is already happening. And you can imagine that process being magnified and amplified of that movement, okay? And here's another term. Goodness, from another report. Actually, you know, now that I hear myself talking like, wow, I really do seem to spend a lot of time reading reports. I need to get out there more often. So, but actually this was last week. Wow, last week. This is a report that came up with yet another term, community-driven relocation. This is the National Academy of Sciences, put out this report. Considering the effects of rising sea levels on a stretch of the US coast, going from Houston, New Orleans, the Gulf of Mexico, the southern coast of Florida, the Atlantic coast of Florida. Now let's see if I remember my geography. Georgia, I was gonna say Georgia, Georgia, South Carolina. I mean, that's a vast stretch of coast. There are many, many types of communities. And this report, kind of striking, comes out and says, most of those communities are gonna have to move. Oh, by the way, isn't this, if you want an instance of poetic justice, there is one industry that's gonna be also very directly affected by that rise in sea level. And it so happens that most of the oil refining capacity in the United States, I think you will appreciate this. Whenever I think of the oil industry, I think of you. Not in a bad way. No, I don't mean to say, wow. No, it's like because you've actually come from there. It's like you've been there. You can tell us. I mean that way. That the bulk of the oil refining capacity in the United States happens to be located along the coast between Houston and New Orleans. all of those oil refineries will have to be relocated. I think that's poetic justice. And the question is, where? Where are they going to be moved? Which community is out there saying, I'll be great. Bring me an oil refinery. That would really do wonders for the neighborhood. But, okay? But, and now if you ask, is there any experience anywhere in the world of relocating oil refineries? No. Oil refineries, we build them, we use them, and we stop using them when they have been obsolete. Relocating them? So this is a very serious issue. And this report introduces this notion of community-driven relocation. Again, easy to describe what it is. It should be a relocation effort where everybody involved is okay with it. There, that's, okay, that makes sense. There is a chapter on how to bring about community-driven relocation. It's a very short chapter. We need lots of research into this. And the National Science Foundations should allocate lots of funding into this. Okay, that's reassuring. I agree. But again, it's not trivial. What does that mean? Now, again, there's a baseline model. I want to be very careful about identifying this baseline model, okay? Because I'm going to refer to it as the, let's say, straightforward Econ 101 baseline model. And for me, that's not an insult. I was trained as an economist, okay? Just to say, look, the relocation is going to be, those who can move first are going to move first. As things get really bad, more people will move. They will find a way. It's not going to be nice. It's not going to be pretty. I'm not making any pretense that it is. But the burden is on you if you think we can do better than that. And I think we should take that seriously. But right before this time together, I was reconnected with the little economist in me because I had a meeting in Ringin's office. And the way I was sitting, I had a clear look at her bookcase. And I said, wow, this is bringing a tear to my eye. These are hardcore econ books. I mean, anybody, so if I had taken a picture of that bookcase, which I don't know how to do, and uploaded on Instagram, which I don't know how to do that, but I do know Instagram exists, and I were to ask people, who do you think owns this book? Oh, the answer would have been hardcore Chicago economists who thinks there should be a market for babies. I'm not saying that's you, but I'm saying that sort of put me in the mood of like, oh yeah, there's this way of thinking, which, so again, if we believe it ought to be different, and this report is a call to the research community to ask, how is that going to happen? But it's quite striking the emphasis that is going to happen one way or another. So managed retreat, community-driven relocation, climate change eviction, and I'm sure there are many other terms out there, but I think that's, to me, does represent a new research frontier, which absolutely requires us, people like us, we are people, to engage with these communities and to think seriously of what is this going to be. And again, what are the markers? How do you know? When do you decide we've done what we can? And by the way, and of course, we have a true expert on urban heat, but the view seems to be that keeping the sea at bay, pardon the pun, is much more difficult than adapting to heat, much more difficult and much more costly. And I'm gonna conclude by referring to, well, guess what? Another study. Gee. I do assure you, I do other things. You know, I teach. There are witnesses to that. I also spend a large part of my day drinking coffee, and the other part of my day is cleaning cat litter. Wow, that's it. I drink coffee, I teach, I read reports, I clean cat litter. Wow. That's a pretty exciting life. Yeah, it's pretty exciting. Okay. Okay, where was I? Sorry? Yeah, okay. Yeah. But by the way, I do something else. Yeah. Over the winter break, I read 1,911 undergraduate syllabi at ASU as part of the expedited review process. But hey, the economist in me, I was able to negotiate a release from cat cleaning litter. I spoke with my wife, said, look, I'm reading all this. Can you? So I will read undergraduate syllabi all day long over cleaning cat litter. I digress. Let's go back to this. The forcefulness of this conclusion, this report, I thought was quite striking. There's another one. It came out in the fall of 2021, where actually a variety of governments, the state government of Texas, the state government of Louisiana, the city government of Houston, the city government of Louisiana, various counties along the stretch of coast, they all together asked the US Army Corps of Engineers, which you know what they are, hardcore engineers, to come up with some estimate of what it will cost, given current technology, to prevent that stretch of coast between Houston and New Orleans from coming under the effects of rising sea levels. Can it be done? First question. Can it be done? Yes. Okay. How much will it cost? You can download the report. Now, of course, it's with current technology. But that's not a good bad start. And they came up with an estimate. If I recall correctly, it was about $300 billion. Now you say, it's an estimate. It's $200 billion. Okay. There, you want to know? That's my estimate. Wow, that's interesting, of course, because then it immediately raises the question, who is going to finance that? Interestingly enough, in case you associate, okay, I hope this is not stereotyping, but in case you associate Texas with lots of people who don't like the federal government, when it comes to thinking about where we're going to come up with $200 billion, oh, I know, let's ask the federal government. But again, that's a tremendous challenge. So I think we need to embrace, well, maybe not embrace this, that's too nice a term, but we need to engage with this. Well, that's it, because I said I wanted to have time to hear, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do community relocation?
Wait, we're recording, so you have to use the microphone.
Thank you so much, Jose. It's always wonderful to hear you talk about it. I'd been thinking about one thing I wanted to ask you. So for the past 3 years, I've been working with the refugee communities in Arizona. And this is a part of an NSF grant. So one of the things that we've looked at is the refugee camps that these refugees have come, the Rohingyas in Bangladesh, the Bhutanese, the Syrians in the lab, and these are more than 1 million people. So these are sometimes bigger than slums that you talked about. And they are no longer transit. They've been there for decades now. They're almost small cities, and they are located in places where extreme weather events have enormous, almost multiplier effects in terms of rainfall, in terms of other kind of disasters. So talking with the refugee communities, which I've been doing for 3 years here, the Syrians, the Bhutanese, the Rwandans, the Burundians here, has made us really think about this niche-based slum, if you would, and nobody seems to be doing anything. So I find a huge gap, if you will,
I agree.
in terms, and this is community-driven, anything that's happening there in terms of adaptation, or even, there's no such thing as mitigation happening there. So any thoughts on your part? And there's about, I think, 65,000 refugee communities here. And they are very vibrant in Arizona. And so their connection back, and some of them are very educated. So I've been working with a group of other researchers here. And I think this is an urban sustainability niche that needs to be really tackled. So I would like to hear some thoughts. Thank you.
I completely agree. Maybe the only thing I can mention is, I know of one instance, there are many, but where there has begun to be a dialogue between both organizations that work with informal settlements and organizations that work with refugees, refugee camps. And that has been in South Africa. But there is an awareness. Again, if you want to think about scenarios, and nice scenarios, but there's an awareness that if large numbers of people begin to relocate away from cities and they move somewhere, and you ask, well, first there's a question, where is that somewhere? Where are you going to move? But then you ask, what literally are they going to move to? Like, I'm here, and there is already a discussion that that might end up just being, let's say, different type of refugee camp. So there is an awareness that there's these two experiences, and these two communities need to talk and facilitate that. I myself can easily imagine a situation where large relocation of people away from urban areas along coast ends up being they're moving to the effect of refugee camps. They might not have that label because, so you're entirely right. I would say it's not an, well, it might be a niche in one sense, but I think it's talking about how will climate change affect communities who are not in very nice structures or high-rise apartments. And from that perspective, refugee camps are among there. So I think that's yeah, yeah, something else we should engage. Thank you for bringing that up. That's it. But at least in one place in South Africa, it's starting. But it just started. Yeah, that's, and you hear the term climate change refugees, that happens. I mean, that term now is used as a matter of, yeah, we're gonna have that.
Great presentation, Jose. One quick question, well, two. First, what can you say about conflict and armed conflict in some global South countries and how that might prevent some adaptation measures? We see it a lot, for instance, in Ecuador, we see it in El Salvador. There has been a rise of both very specific type of governments trying to solve some violence, and that might cause some adaptation issues for climate change. And the second one is, we have lots of students here. What do you think they should be doing their research on in order to solve some of these issues?
Oh, okay. Well, the research part, well, well, about the first one, another fantastic question, that issue. But you know, that it allows me to maybe highlight this issue of synergies or trade-offs about giving people's choices. So again, you may or may not have been following what's been going on in this otherwise small Central American country, but which the United States had a big impact on its history, El Salvador, okay? In a previous life, when I worked with the United Nations, I was very familiar with what happened there. And well, over the years, San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador, it would not be an exaggeration to say there was no state presence in those streets, okay? It was very violent. Very theatrical violence even, of the type that we also see in parts of Mexico. And, you know, this really matters because that, if you follow what's been happening, El Salvador just re-elected massively a person as president. Okay, how can I say this politely? Makes Trump be a Jeffersonian Democrat. But I think it's, and by the way, I'm horrified by it, but I can also tell you that I know of a lot of San Salvadorians that said, you don't know, Jose, what's it like to live in fear. That I step out the house, and what I'm thinking about is not climate change, adaptation, employment. I don't want to, I would like to believe that I can go to a local supermarket without there being a significant risk that a hand grenade will be thrown at it. And so if you look at the election campaign in El Salvador, which by the way, stands to be very much affected by rising sea levels, there was absolutely nothing. So to me, that's just an example that in many parts of the world, the violence that communities are experiencing as a result of gangs, it has become very important. One more thing for us to think about. And so I would say, well, yeah, you want to do something about San Salvador? Okay, whatever you need to do about San Salvador to make it more adaptive, you have to do it in the context of how you're going to address this issue of safety. By the way, I can also mention that's also a big issue in another city. Let's take Cape Town, South Africa. It's very beautiful. But for large numbers of people in Cape Town who live in informal settlements, the number one issue is not rising sea levels, it's personal safety. So I agree with you that in an almost surprising way, because 10 years ago, how many of us were thinking about what's going to be the intersection of responding to climate change, population movements, and this type of violence? Probably not many, and now it has come. So I believe that is a topic that a lot of our students should be researching and writing dissertations about. Now, will ASU like some of our PhD students to go to San Salvador and go to Quito, to go into these neighborhoods, to interview some of these young persons? You're 16 years old. What led you to become a hired assassin? Can you talk to me? I mean, that's, okay, maybe not, but those are sicarios, okay? That's a term, by the way, that has become part of our discourse in Latin America, sicario. We all know what it is. And if you want to hear songs about sicarios, you know, there are, Phoenix has 3 or 4 radio stations that play music that you hear in northern Mexico. And songs celebrating sicarios are very common. I believe that at some point, I don't know, in the Al Gore era, there was a lot of concern in the United States, oh, the lyrics of these rap songs is going to make every young person like a criminal. Oh my God, what's going on? Those lyrics are absolutely nothing compared to the song celebrating sicarios. So the way this violence is now being woven into the urban fabric of many cities in Latin America. So graduate students, please study this. Although we have to find a way, how to do field work. Well, that's up to the administration, but seriously, yeah, that's another great area. In Latin America now, you cannot, if you want to think about doing something in a city, if you cannot tackle this issue of, because it's not just El Salvador and it's not just, well, let me take the case of Mexico. I can tell you, no names, but I can tell you that the person overseeing the population census in Mexico, you know, they want to do a population, you know, go around, count Mexicans. That person, for him or her, not to give, to feel that he or she can send, you know, census counters. I want to send Chuck to northern Mexico to count people. He or she, in effect, had to, through back channels, get the approval of the cartels. To me, the moment you need to get the approval of cartels to the population census, that's something. So, yeah, wow, great question. And in Latin America, you cannot avoid it. And if you've been following what happened in Ecuador, that's just, but I learned something, by the way. Well, I learned something. One last thing that I've learned. Okay. So here's a tidbit. If you, I learned this. If you ever want to transport an amount of cocaine and have airport dogs not smell it, put lots of banana. It seems that the chemical composition of bananas really effectively masks the smell of cocaine. I did not know that. I'm not going to commercialize.
Jose, I'm going to just ask a very quick question. Well, I don't know if it's quick. Maybe we can get Marty his hand up too. We can get both of us in time. I'm just interested in your perspective on urbanization as an exogenous force in a lot of these documents that you're reading versus something that actually we are managing. Because I have a sense that when we talk about adaptation in urban areas, it's this as if it is urbanization is happening to cities. But when we think about what informality is, the politics of what is determined to be informal, where are the boundaries of what a city decides, city managers decide to govern and where they don't. These are all political issues. And I think it's really critical when you think about community-driven adaptation, that's kind of also putting the burden on communities that are outside of formal governance responsibilities. They don't have the same social contracts as, I think there's justice issues in terms of how we think about urbanization as something that we actually make decisions about why there are settlements on particular areas of the coastline, who gets to settle there, who's evicted, who isn't evicted, and what happens to that land afterwards, and whether we actually are willing to even address limits to urbanization in the face of climate change. And I think, just as you said, we looked at this in Mexico City, 600 years, repeated attempts repeated events that showed that the cities was really not sustainable in its location. But we always found ways to engineer a few decades more until the next flood. So I think, somehow the politics of this wasn't. I didn't hear that in your talk, and I don't know what your perspective on it.
Well, it's a tremendous issue because urbanization is that type of term. Many of us can use it. Yeah, we know what I mean. But actually, when you ask, what is driving urbanization? And also to the point, is that good or bad? There's a long prejudice. There's a long tradition of describing urbanization as a problem. And even these many reports that I've read, I guess I'm going to come out of the closet. I think urbanization is useful, it's good, it's a driver of development. But I am very primed to reading, urbanization, is it a problem? Is it a problem? And it's often talked as if it's something that's done to people. But there are many instances where urbanization is literally an expansion of an urban area because people, let's say, leave the countryside in Brazil to go to Sao Paulo. And it's very easy to go to a slum in Sao Paulo and look around and say, this is miserable. Who would want to be here? And you talk to the inhabitants and say, well, it's actually worse in the countryside. So I completely agree with you that it's almost like we have to take seriously, first of all, what is urbanization, what's driving it? And I want to emphasize how those processes, some of them are the result of violence, some of them are the result of people being evicted from their lands. How is that leading to this increase in urban areas? Absolutely. But I think there is a historical prejudice that urbanization is a problem. And rather than saying, well, walk to these communities. Informal settlements, you're exactly right. That's why the number one struggle of slums worldwide is the insecurity of land, which is a legal act, it's a political act. The city of Cape Town, the government of Cape Town could just legalize Kalisha. It's been years. It's nominally a progressive government. Mayor of Kalisha has a big picture of Mandela in her office. Well, act on it. Legalize his land. Maybe easy for me to say, I'm not the mayor of Cape Town, but this, yeah. Yes, if I did not clearly highlight that urbanization, I happen to think urbanization is more often than not an endogenous response to many factors.
Jose, my name is Ed Chu, and I don't know a lot of people, so I'm just here temporarily, and I have been a practitioner, so I'm going to sort of frame this in a policy context. So I hope that some of the challenges that policymakers have should be the focus of research and analysis, right? And so I have actually moved people as a Fed. But that issue of people needing to move have been around for centuries, right? So let me just put that aside. But the issue about knowledge, and adaptation, focus on adaptation versus mitigation. At least from where I work, which is 30 years at Environmental Protection Agency, I've worked, my first climate project was in 1987. The issue is really, we have finally got to a point of really understanding that the issue of global warming is one of scale, right, for adaptation. Until recently, we could not figure out what the risks were very locally because impacts are local. You would have to agree with that. And where the impacts are being felt are again, I'm going to generalize, but where people need the help most. They are poorer parts of the world. That's why we talk about the North and South. Even in the United States, if you think about where the states that have been most affected by weather events and so on are certain parts of the country that actually have lots of communities that have already been overburdened with other things. So what I'm trying to get at is it's not necessarily knowledge, but the knowledge is important. What knowledge is important is not research about migration and other things, but how climate is affecting us very locally. What are the risks in Phoenix? Not necessarily what is the risk for the United States or Southwest region. And then what is the solution for Phoenix, right? This is not a solution that we need for Seattle, but what is the solution for Phoenix? So what is the solution for Mexico City and so on? And then the question is, if one of the solutions after engagement is mobility, because we can't solve migration problems in the entire world, but at least climate-related, weather-related migration could be solved. But that has to do with the fact that it is really about engagement, in my opinion, because we've moved Alaskan tribes. I don't know if you guys know this or not. Alaskan tribes are already moving inland with the help of the federal government. We've moved entire communities in the United States, in Oklahoma and so on, because of contaminated properties and so on. But that's all for the positive, right? We have other issues as well. But I just want to focus on the fact that what we need is better information about risk at the very fine resolution at the local level for policymakers, and then figuring out what to do. And the final thing, the economists in the room, I will say, is the fact that the thing that's lacking the most and research is needed most is how to bring investments to local community to fix this problem. Because United Nations also has put out reports, which I will recommend to you, about the shortage in funding that's available to address local resiliency and adaptation, right? People have spent a lot of money on mitigation, decarbonization, but not on resilience. So I will kind of make that as a plug as another research area as well. So
Thank you.
thanks.
And I read the report as well, by the way.
Yeah, and I appreciate.
Any reports you think I should read, send them my way. I'll read them for you. I'll summarize them for you for free. You'll fill out my social agenda. But I completely agree with all your comments. Yes, yes, yep. Yeah, again, I have no social life, as you can tell, so I can stay if you want to ask more questions, but thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much, Jose. Please stick around. I know there were more questions in the audience. There's food back out those two doors there. Our next speaker is Karen Fisher-Vanden, coming in from Penn State. Josh will have more information at the next faculty meeting about that talk, but hopefully you can all come. And that's on February 28th, I believe. So the last Wednesday in February. So please come there. But thank you everyone for coming today.